This is a cardinal sin of EDM right here.
Just dive in and say I'm a trance DJ.
Skip! I'm definitely a little late to the party here, but I've been wanting to make this video for quite a while, so when a friend of mine allowed me to have access to his nearly expired Masterclass account, I went for it, watched the 6-ish hour Deadmau5 Masterclass, and have come to you today to give you my thoughts on it, and also to give you a thorough rundown of what goes on in the Masterclass and what I took away from it. So this video is going to be in kind of 3 parts. First of all, I'm going to give my overall opinion on it and kind of set you up for what the Masterclass was like. The second major part is I'm going to talk you through point by point what was discussed and what I learned from it. And the third part will be some closing thoughts to kind of tie everything together. So let's start off on what I thought of the Masterclass in general. And for the time being, let's leave aside Joel Zimmerman's abrasive, arrogant, and somewhat controversial approach to the world. We'll come back to that. But for the time being, let's just talk about the Masterclass itself. To answer the question in the thumbnail, is the Masterclass worth the price and the time spent? In my opinion, no, with a couple caveats, because regardless of whether or not you actually go for it, you should know what you're in for, because it presents it as a very structured, almost school-like thing where your instructor just happens to be a world-famous producer and DJ, and that's kind of the case. It wants to be that when it grows up, but it doesn't quite get there. The best way to think of this masterclass is just you sitting in Joel's studio, looking over his shoulder, him just kind of explaining stuff about music production and demonstrating some of it, rambling and ranting a bit. And there are some parts where that works really well. For instance, I'm going to talk a bit about where he shows his modular rig, and that part, he's clearly very excited to just show off this cool thing. And so that part feels really good to watch. Even if you didn't necessarily need Deadmau5 to teach you that, that's something that if you're a Deadmau5 fan and you would be interested in hanging out in his studio, that's something that might be worth it for some people. Same with when he shows in real time his composition workflow and how he comes up with song ideas. That I really enjoyed, and that was actually my favorite part, and I'll come back to that once again in the next section of the video. There's a lot of stuff that he teaches you that's elementary and basic, where I'm sitting there going, you didn't need Deadmau5 to teach you this, you could have learned this from a tutorial on YouTube. And then there's other stuff that's too specific to Deadmau5 in terms of it's more just him kind of just sharing his opinion, and maybe you'll find it useful, but more than likely you probably won't. The best material in the masterclass hits a middle ground where it's him showing specific stuff about how he works, and you get a bit of a peek into his mind and his creativity. That's really inspiring, and that's where it makes sense that it's Deadmau5 specifically and not just someone else teaching you elementary stuff. If you're a beginner producer, you'll probably find some value in it, but I want to be very clear that you do not need to drop masterclass prices to learn beginner stuff. There are a ton of resources on YouTube, I'll link a few below, that will effectively introduce you to important electronic music production concepts for free. Also, while the bright spots of this kind of series are really fun to watch and are quite inspiring, a lot of it is a slog. And about 2/3 of the way through, I kind of found myself tuning out and dreading going on. And I kind of had to force myself because I really wanted to make this video because I thought it would be interesting. So moving on to the specifics, I took a ton of notes. Like, when I say a ton of notes, I mean a ton of notes, and I'm going to leave a link in the description with a PDF of this notes. Hopefully you can read my handwriting, and this will go more in depth than this video does. I'm just going to be cherry picking stuff that I think is worth noting, walking you through what's covered in the course. So to start things off, there's a little trailer thing. It's basically a trailer for the course itself, and then you get into part 2, which is all about theory. And this is where you get introduced to the interview format. And over the course of this series, it becomes pretty clear that this was filmed over the course of like 1 or 2 days. And for a lot of it, Joel really isn't in control. He's either answering interview questions or showing off stuff that people asked him to show off. And then the editors go in and try to add some semblance of structure after the fact, which in terms of making it worth a celebrity's time and turning out a decent product, that's not necessarily a bad way to do it. but it's definitely not the most organized or polished result, even though it has very high production value and a high-profile celebrity teaching it. So in the theory part, he talks about how he likes to work late at night, so it kind of inhibits his judgment of ideas so he can get more into a creative flow state where he's more likely to make some more unorthodox ideas. For Joel, songs aren't necessarily tied to very specific meanings and ideas, and they're not usually inspired out of the blue. He tends to just tinker until he comes up with something cool and then kind of workshop that until it's something good. Which, that's a really valuable thing to hear, because creative work, to a degree, should be treated like a job, where you show up whether or not you feel like it, and then you try to come up with something, and more often than not, that'll lead to you coming up with more ideas and better ideas. And this is something that I do appreciate him emphasizing, and that's good for people to hear that from a professional who has released so many iconic songs. He also talked about how he usually starts not with sound design. Sound design comes relatively late in the game, but with melody and chords, and usually with chords, and I'll talk about this a bit more in the demonstration portion of the class, but this is something that's good to know, good to get inside his head, and that he uses what he calls Mr. Potato Head music production. And he uses this kind of derisively towards the practice of just downloading a bunch of loops from Splice and then throwing them together and calling it your song. Of course, given the fact that he's Deadmau5, you can already imagine his opinion and kind of tone he takes on that. He's very dismissive of that, but he does like the approach of basically building up your own library of musical ideas and sounds and all that kind of stuff. And then once you have a bunch of them that might go well together, kind of cobbling them together and making a song out of that, which I think is a really valuable piece of advice. However, that's been public knowledge that he likes this method of working for quite a while, so you didn't need to hear it from the masterclass. That information's out there already. He also mentioned the fact that he likes to pull musical inspiration from sources outside of his genre. So for instance, he mentioned his enjoyment of the band 9 Inch Nails and how he tried to pull some of their kind of dark, moody sounding chords into what at the time was kind of a very upbeat, happy electronic music scene. Moving on to part 3, this is showing his process, and this is by far my favorite part of the entire masterclass. And if you are really a diehard fan of Joel's composition style and really want to see how he does it and replicate it for yourself, maybe this part makes the masterclass worth it, although I would recommend watching some other folks' masterclasses to make it worth it, because it's expensive. So even this maybe doesn't make it worth it, but I really enjoyed this section a lot, and I found it tremendously inspiring, so I'm gonna spend some time on this one. Joel isn't a piano player. He likes to draw in MIDI notes, and he does a lot of it by ear. He seems to have a decent grasp on theory, but it's an intuitive sense, not really a structured academic sense. And so it'll start with him just clicking in basically your bass notes, your root notes, and finding something that sparks his interest. From there, he starts stacking notes to build chords out of that kind of main root note progression, and he spends some time making sure that that loops effectively. He calls it resolving, and that's not quite what resolution is in a music theory sense, but it's an effective way of thinking about it. Basically, you want your melodic loop, or your chord loop, to loop cleanly to where the end implies the beginning. It flows musically. And once he's stacked notes to make chords, then he starts to phrase them and add some rhythmic aspects to them and the way they're spaced apart and whatnot. And sometimes he'll bring in a rhythmic loop, not to actually use in the song, but to help spark chord phrasing and structure ideas. From there, he sets the tempo, does a bit of basic synth shaping just to kind of get an idea of the vibe he's going for, and then he'll start to write a melody line on top of that. And real quick, I'm gonna skip forward to part 5, which is dedicated to melodic structure, because this is tied in. This is really my favorite part. This was super inspiring. He talked about making music loop cleanly, like I mentioned before. He shows how he goes by ear and mentions that the most important part of your chord progression is your first chord and your last chord. And anything in between, you can just kind of go with, but that first and last chord really have to work well together. And this leads me to my favorite gem in the entire masterclass, which is his use of drone notes. And this is nothing revolutionary in electronic music, but it's an interesting compositional tool rather than just an arrangement tool. So let me explain what I mean by that. I wrote this down. A good example is this song right here. So in this case, he started that with one note, just going on and on and on. And he uses that as a reference to write to. And he could even remove it afterwards, but the nice thing about having one drone note going through the whole thing is that it kind of forces the notes that you write around it to be tied together. And it's kind of an interesting little hack for writing melody and harmony that sounds nice and sounds consistent. I've used and heard drone notes in electronic music before, but I never thought to do that on purpose as a compositional technique, as a way to spark composition. And also, this is a really good insight into his mind and how he likes to work. Watching him work as fast as he does is pretty inspiring as well. He knows what he likes and knows whether or not an idea is working or not, and so he's just throwing notes around. He knows his DAW super well, and watching him work like that is very inspiring and does make me want to get better at my efficiency of trying out ideas and moving on to newer, better iterations of those ideas. Jumping back to part 4, briefly, he talks about building up your home studio. Most of this you can just skip. He talks about whether or not digital is better and whether or not analog is better, and he's got his own opinions on that. Digital signals sound fine and go with them, but also analog synths sound better. Lists off a bunch of DAW names and never commits to recommending one or the other, which I think is good. I think it's good that he says you don't need one DAW and that's the only one that's good. I think it's good that beginners know you can make good music in pretty much any platform, but at the same time, you didn't need Joel to just sit there and list off DAWs. He talks about how he doesn't like to work on headphones and he much prefers speakers and says they're more accurate, which is debatable, but fine, I'll give him that. He makes better mixes than I ever will, so I can't nitpick that too much. But in general, this whole section was in desperate need of a better editor. Not just an editor who cut between camera angles, but an editor who whittled it down to only the useful information. So there's a bunch of him just kind of waffling and rambling that really could have benefited from just being cut. Part 6 is devoted to turning melodies into structures. Once he's got his sustained chords, he can then start to develop those into some kind of musical idea that can get stuck in your head. And so he shows adding kicks that are tuned to the key of the song. He shows side chaining. He shows how he likes to sometimes take the upper harmony notes of his chord progression and use them to start a lead part. And he shows what we all kind of knew, he loves ARPs. And he uses arpeggiators, especially Cthulhu, quite a bit. He likes using fifths and sevenths in an ARP context, and often he'll have different arpeggios kind of cut in and out, and that will build up kind of an unorthodox melodic structure. One thing he did say that I did like is that all of his song ideas are derived from sustained chords because that's all music is, which is not a bad way to think about it, and it definitely gives you quite a bit of insight into how Deadmau5 composes music. Part 7 is synth sounds, and this is a bit of a mixed bag because this is definitely a case where you didn't need Deadmau5 to teach you this. I did a video on synth sounds for beginners before I ever saw this, and I'll link it down below. It's completely free, obviously, and people seem to find it helpful. I think it's decent, so if you're looking to learn how to make all the kind of essential sounds in electronic music, check the link in the description or at the end of this video. But he talks about how to make the signature pluck, which is pretty straightforward. He talks through waveforms, filter envelopes, unison, LFOs. It's all good information and presented fairly well, but you don't need Deadmau5 to teach you this. You can find that information for free here on YouTube. He also spent some time rambling about presets, which probably just should have been cut. And he spent some time talking about the fact that on one hand, you can learn synthesis on pretty much anything out there, whether or not it's hardware or software, which I think is great to hear from a professional. And it can kind of kill gear acquisition syndrome in beginners, thinking that a new piece of gear is the only thing standing between them and good music. But on the other hand, he does tend to prefer analog and the way it sounds for elements that are center stage, although he will typically use VSTs for a bunch of other stuff. Part 8 is devoted to Modular, and I mentioned before that I really liked this part. Once again, this is not stuff that you needed Joel to teach you. Andrew Huang has a really good video here on YouTube giving you a very thorough introduction to how Modular works and how to use it. But I enjoyed this section because this is just Joel in the studio showing you stuff that he thinks is cool. This felt good to watch, especially because I'm thinking about kind of dipping my toes into Modular, so this came at a good time, and hearing it from Joel is cool. So he talks about modules and how they work, the fact that you have oscillators and modifiers, and those are the basic kinds of elements to a modular setup. talked about voltage and outputting stuff into different stuff and how signal flow works. I will give huge props to the editors here because they use some really nice graphics to visually show how the sound was being affected. I wish that quality of editing had gone into the rest of this. He then shows some more patching. He talks about effects, shows some pretty insane stuff using a delay and some kind of out there sounds, which I liked quite a bit. He does do a good job of making Modular feel less intimidating, which I really appreciated. And he talks about how he likes Modular's capability to make sounds that are pretty much impossible to recreate, especially if you're using a ton of modules and a ton of patching. And he did mention that sometimes he'll use Modular to design an already written synth part, but most of the time he'll just do a bunch of stuff, record that whole thing, and then chop out the best little bits for kind of bells and whistles in a song. Moving on to chapter 9, this is analog versus digital. And this is basically Joel does a gear shootout where he compares the sound of analog synthesis and the sound of digital synthesis. And in my humble opinion, this whole segment is entirely useless and basically could have been cut. Although, to their credit, I think they left it in because this is something that Joel clearly cares about and clearly wanted to demonstrate. For that, it might have been worth keeping in, but still, there's really nothing to learn here. Especially since most people don't have access to the super expensive stuff that he uses. Why bother worrying about what's different? Just make the most of what you have. Let's move on to part 10, which is effects and shaping sounds. And this is the part where the infamous cardinal sin of EDM line comes from. And he talks about people overusing presets that do all the stuff for you and how he doesn't like that. And for the most part, that's just kind of a Deadmau5 style rant, but he does mention that he and other fellow label owners do recognize when people use presets when they're listening to music that they might want to sign, and that it can make the producer seem lazy in the eyes of the label person. So bear that in mind. That's a good insight into how he thinks when he's looking for music to sign, and I'll come back to that because he did a whole segment on this that was pretty good. And this part was pretty cool because he talks about how he likes to use effects to really shape a sound, and the fact that they're really underrated for A, shaping a sound in general, and B, making sounds that are unique that someone else is very unlikely to have made. Because he likes to even get cheap guitar pedals, like distortion units and whatnot, and run sounds through them. And this is something that you can do because there are a lot of guitar pedals out there and a lot of them are pretty cheap, and he'll get other effects, outboard effects or VST effects, and run synth sounds through them and in different combinations to get unique sounds that you couldn't just get with one plugin alone or one synth alone. He talks a bit about getting width in your synths and the Haas effect. Once again, good to know, but you don't need Deadmau5 to teach you this. And he talks a bit about embracing jank. If you have cheap gear, lean into a lo-fi aesthetic and make that jank a feature instead of a bug. Moving on to part 11 and 12, this is where he talks about how he makes his drums and his beats. And while this was a good segment, a lot of this stuff is available for free on the internet in various places. I myself, and I swear this video is not like a self-promotional tactic, this is just me directing you to stuff that I think could be helpful for you. I did a pretty thorough video on how to put together progressive house drums, and a lot of the tricks and techniques that he talks about in here I talk about in that video because a lot of information has been out there already, and so I kind of brought it all together for that video. I'll link that in the description and at the end of this video. So once again, there's some good insight into how he works and how he approaches drums, and the part where he walks you through the like 10 drum layers of snow cone was pretty cool. But once again, you didn't need Deadmau5 to teach you this necessarily. One pretty cool technique that he did show though that was new to me and kind of an important part of the Deadmau5 drum sound is the fact that he likes to put reverbs on his snares, but then sidechain that reverb to the kick. That way it keeps the reverb clean and not interfering with anything else, and adds kind of this cool compressed pumping effect as well. And I do recommend giving this a go. It does sound pretty sick, and he demonstrates that, and that's a little gem in that part of the video. He also goes on a bit of a weird anti-drum rant in that if he could get away with not putting drums in his songs, he would. He tends to care much more about the melodic part, which I get, and you can kind of hear that in a lot of his music, but I disagree that drums aren't a useful arrangement tool. I think, as a lifelong drummer, I think that drums are hugely important for arrangement purposes and can do a lot to raise and lower the energy level of a song. But of course, that's just different tastes in music and different approaches. Part 13 is dedicated to structuring songs. He talks about how the structure of a lot of electronic music is already kind of hard-coded into it, And electronic music already kind of follows its own form of verse, chorus, bridge, chorus, outro. But it's a bit different, of course, and you can pretty much reverse engineer this just by listening to any Deadmau5 song or any other electronic music that you like and writing down exactly what the structure is, and then kind of going from there. He does show how to take your gigantic kind of main 8 or 16 bar loop and then deconstruct it and then build it back up over the course of the song, which is good for beginners to know. It's a very effective way of making electronic music. And he does talk about basically once you have written an 8 bar loop or a 16 bar loop, your song's done essentially, because then all you have to do is structure it out and build up energy levels. He also mentioned that song length depends on the song and in some cases is somewhat arbitrary. And he also showed how once he has a rough arrangement, he'll go in and add little bits of ear candy to keep a song interesting as it progresses. He talks about how he thinks about live shows when arranging songs, and he tries to make intros and outros that can flow together smoothly. And finally, he talks about the fact that he doesn't like the current EDM structure of super obvious build-up and then the 3, 2, 1 jump into a bombastic drop, which I don't have a problem with, but he definitely does. And how he prefers other subtler ways of building energy and going into drops, which I can appreciate that viewpoint, and I'm all for people experimenting and turning conventions on their head, but he never actually says what those methods are, but you can definitely pick them up from listening to his music. Part 14 is talking about remixing, and he shows very little here. He just talks about what he looks for in a remix, and that his ideal remix basically takes the main idea of a song and maybe just one element, and then builds a whole new song around it. That whole segment is basically just that. It could have been over in 2 minutes, and they stretch it out a bit into rants and whatnot. Part 15 is dedicated to mixing, and this is a part that I was really hoping would be not just good, but great. And it was fine, but maybe there's a legit reason for that, and I'll get to that. So he talks about how, to a degree, you mix as you go, kind of earballing it. You want your master to hit around -6 decibels and make sure nothing's clipping or overloading. He'll often cut a lot of synth lows and low mids to make room for the bass, which is a good practice to get into. He demonstrates sidechain compression and how that works, which is vital for new electronic music producers to know, but you don't need Deadmau5 to teach you that. Although one little gem in here that he talks about is the fact that your bass doesn't necessarily hit at the same volume on every note, because the lower on a bass you go, the more low end there is. So the more low end, the louder that bass element is. And so to keep basses nice and punchy and even, he likes to put a limiter on it to brick wall it so everything hits at the exact same level. And this is something I definitely intend to start incorporating into my own tracks. That's a really good idea and I'm about it. But other than that, most of the stuff he shows is either pretty basic or just not all that technical. And this actually leads to an important point. The reason Joel is such a good mixer is not because of a bunch of secret techniques, and it's not because of his gear, it's because he has a fantastic ear. He's really good at listening for what a mix needs, and he has really good taste in how a mix should sound, and then he's just got enough technical knowledge to make that a reality. And that's something that only comes through time and practice and listening to a lot of music and making a lot of music. So maybe I was an idiot for going into it with such high expectations in the first place. He also mentions the fact that you can do this all in the box just with software, and that he uses hardware, but only because he likes it and that it's not strictly necessary. Part 16 is devoted to mastering. He talks about how he likes mastering his own stuff and then goes on a bit of a rant about how he likes doing everything himself and believes in doing everything himself and must do everything himself. And it becomes this kind of weird tangent, but that's Joel and that's how he is. And if you like that about him, you'll probably enjoy it. He discusses how his approach to mastering is pretty simple. It's mostly just controlling dynamics and adjusting frequencies. He talks about how he likes to cut lows around 30 hertz because this is stuff that takes up precious headroom that you're not gonna hear. Like, maybe you'll feel it on the biggest speakers ever, but other than that, it does nothing and just clogs up headroom. So it's a good practice just to cut that off on your entire master around 30 hertz. He also talks a bit about what limiting is and the fact that your kick should probably be pushing the limiter and triggering the limiter the most, which is good practice in a lot of electronic music production, and it allows the kick to kind of take center stage, but because the limiter's clamping down on it so hard, it doesn't stick out unnecessarily. At this point, you can kind of tell he's getting tired while shooting this. The day's going on a little too long, and at this point I'm going, okay, someone bring this man a cup of coffee. He's starting to lose it a little bit. and the rants are getting more frequent and a little more kind of jaded. Once again, you can tell that the decision was made to just kind of slog through this in one day, and it really does affect the viewing experience. From here, he mentions there's no one magical thing that mastering can do to your mix. He demonstrates how he uses OTT and talks a bit about the loudness war, and goes on a bit of a rant about achieving proper loudness and how he doesn't like to take feedback from other people unless they're people whose opinion he really trusts, which that's fair. I think you can learn a bit from everyone, but whatever. This is Joel, and Joel does what Joel wants. So once again, I think that could have been cut. Part 17 is also devoted to mastering. He shows his actual mastering chain for Snow Cone, which is pretty cool to see. A lot of it's pretty straightforward, but once again, good to see, and he also demonstrates it on some other plugins. And it's from this point that we start getting back into stuff that I actually really liked and thought was interesting and actually made Joel quite a bit more likable. Because I mentioned before, he's got a somewhat abrasive, jaded, arrogant outlook on things, and a lot of people find that really off-putting, and he's also gone on some like homophobic rants, which he really could have gone without. I kind of don't want to publicly associate myself with him or his music because of the way that he talks publicly and interacts with other public figures. I find it really off-putting, and I think a lot of other people do as well. However, in this section, he starts to become quite a bit more likable, and it's less rant-y and more his approach to the music business and his personal work ethic, which I think a lot of it is actually somewhat admirable, and I appreciate his honesty in this section. So he talks about starting your production career and the fact that no one is out to help your career just out of the goodness of their heart. Getting someone to help you in the music industry should be a win for both parties. And he talks about that when he and his label are looking for people to sign, their ideal candidate is someone who already has a defined sound, already is good on a technical level, and even has a bit of a brand and a theme around them. So he used the example of Rez, who is a great example for someone who already had a very well-defined sound and kind of entire theme associated with her music. And so the label's main job is to just boost her career and promote her, and they don't have to do a ton of work to develop her as an artist. And that's what a lot of labels are looking for these days. That's really good to know going in, and he also mentioned the example of signing Skrillex. Joel has famously talked about how he doesn't like a lot of modern dubstep, and he doesn't like how abrasive it is. I personally love it, but once again, that's just taste. But he talked about how he signed Skrillex not because he was trying to like help him out, and not even because he loved the music, but because he saw Skrillex and knew that this guy was going places, and if Deadmau5 was to boost Skrillex's career, they would both benefit. And he also mentioned that people who are successful don't just spam people, they actually actively engage in their music scene, which is fantastic advice for people trying to get discovered. You need to be meeting people and really becoming a part of your local music community or that music scene, and that's how eventually you get put on. He also talked about how he realized early on that he wanted to do music as a career. This is Joel we're talking about. Joel wanted to do music as a career and realized that even if he couldn't become an artist, he could work his way towards other stuff, say working in a studio as an audio engineer or working as a music promoter. So he worked a day job and then slowly built his music up until he got his break where he had a friend of a friend who played Faxing Berlin on Radio 1, it popped, and that eventually launched his career. That section is pretty well tied in with part 19, which is all about the music business. He learned early on how artists get screwed over and exploited, and he cautions you against that and says get a lawyer and an accountant, and if you are gonna get screwed over early when there's not a whole lot at stake and learn from it and move on. This is definitely getting into unrelatable territory, but he said if you're big enough to need an accountant and they can't answer the simple question, how much money do I have, fire them. He also talked about his approach to albums and the fact that he kind of uses it as a way to collect a body of work, put it out there and move on. And he likes the album format, but acknowledges that it's really not necessary in today's musical scene. And he talked a bit about his approach to song titles, or lack thereof, but once again, he's talked about this in other settings before, and none of that's really all that new. The last few sections are all about the live show, and these actually went a long way towards making Joel quite a bit more likable, and I found this section really interesting. He talked about how his show is neither a DJ set nor pre-recorded, but it's programmed. So he uses a launch pad to launch sound and MIDI clips, and he can kind of do that at will and create little variations in arrangements on the fly if he wants to. But it's also kind of set in stone what he's gonna do because he has it with lights and graphics, because he wants to give the viewer an experience. For him, it's not just about the music, it's about having a whole audio, visual, feeling experience for the viewer and give people something to talk about and remember. And he talks about the time that he dropped Old MacDonald at Ultra and the fact that maybe that was seen as a bit of a troll, but it did get people talking and it did stick in people's heads, and so he considers that a win. Going back to his launching clips, he also talked about the fact that he likes to bring analog synthesizers on the road, and they're like ones that he can afford to lose if they get damaged or stolen, but he'll route those through his setup so that he can launch a MIDI clip and it'll feed into his analog synthesizer, and then he can control parameters of that synthesizer and shape the sound on the fly, which is cool. That's something I would love to do myself. And the fact that he'll even use MIDI to control stuff like lights, and he went deep into learning all the technicals he could of his setup to get more out of it, make it more powerful, make a cooler experience for his live show attendees, and to better troubleshoot when things go wrong. And he gave an anecdote about a time that a totally unexpected tech issue came up and he had to troubleshoot it live on stage and not freak out. And the fact that he'll judge people who go into technical difficulties not by whether or not something goes wrong, because that's inevitable, but by how they react to it. And the best approach is to not freak out, play it off, move on, and don't let it bother you, because if you let it bother you and you freak out on stage, that just makes you unlikable and can really sour a show. A couple other interesting or useful things he mentioned. He talks about how he puts special emphasis on the first track and the last track of a set. So he'll often start it with a really popular track and he'll end it with something like Strobe, a track that's like personally meaningful to him. And people don't tend to remember the middle of a set, but they really remember the start and the end, so some care should be taken making those memorable. He talks about his rehearsal and the fact that when he introduces a new setup, him and his team will rehearse for a few weeks, and then they'll just go out on the road and play that every night like clockwork. He gives the advice to bring a dedicated computer for live stuff. So have a computer for, answering emails and production and stuff, and then have a separate dedicated laptop for live stuff or desktop or whatever he brings, which is definitely good advice. Keeping those two separate can reduce problems and jank. And he talked about the fact that he still gets nervous before shows, but that's mostly because he's afraid that something's gonna break or something's gonna go wrong. And once he gets about a minute in and everything seems to be running smoothly, he can kind of let his brain just run through the show on autopilot. And he talked about, and I really liked this section, he talked about how he really does treat it like another day at the office, in that, for one thing, it allows him to get into the routine of the show and not freak out and feel a ton of pressure to get it right, because it's stuff he's done before and stuff that he knows really well. And also that he never parties on stage and he never goes and gets drunk. He chooses to stay entirely sober and entirely lucid, which I think is really important advice, especially for young DJs who just want to party all the time. And it can often be damaging to a DJ's life or career. You saw that with folks like Avicii, or there's the famous clip of David Guetta just stoned out of his mind on a giant stage, and that's just sad to see. So I appreciated Joel's point of view on this, and that actually did give me a bit more respect for at least his work ethic and his approach to business. And that is the whole masterclass. So hopefully this gave you an idea of, for one thing, what's in it. Hopefully this gave you some useful information, and hopefully this told you whether or not this is worth your time to go and watch. My personal opinion is that once you've heard all this, you will not need to go and watch it, unless you really want to see Joel's workflow and see him explain it. That's, I think, the only thing that makes this worth it. But then again, there are a bunch of clips taken from Twitch of him making music from scratch, and you can just watch those. And now that you know what he's thinking when making those, you can get some use out of them. So hopefully you found this video helpful. Hopefully you found it enjoyable. I know this was a hella long one, so if you're still with me, thank you so much for watching. If you want to check out the two videos that I mentioned earlier, the sound design one and the drums one, I think those are some genuinely valuable videos. And if you're new to making electronic music, I think they're pretty helpful. So if you'd like to check those out, I'd appreciate it. And I'll be back with a new video tomorrow. Peace. Oh no, when did my card get full?